Point-and-click adventures are about as old as mainstream gaming itself. From the early days of Maniac Mansion and Myst to the more modern titles, such as The Walking Dead and Life is Strange, adventure games have always been around in one way or another. While titles such as Grim Fandango and The Secret of Monkey Island have definitely aged in a less than appreciable way gameplay-wise, I've always found the older entries in the genre to be worth playing solely due to the story and their often dry sense of humor. With more recent games, I've felt that the need for a more cinematic and thought-provoking experience has ruined what made the classics, well, classic. This game looks to take what was best from the golden era of the genre and brings it to 2020 with a fresh coat of paint and some pretty smart gameplay conventions. This game is a sequel to Beneath the Steel Sky, a 1994 MS-DOS point-and-click adventure in which you play as Beyond the Steel Sky's main protagonist in a dystopian Australian future. While in most cases, a 26-year gap between games would prove to be a problem, but Beyond the Steel Sky sums the plot of its predecessor pretty efficiently, and in the first few hours, I never felt like I was missing out on not playing the original. So, good job. Visually, Beyond the Steel Sky is pretty damn impressive, no matter what platform you're playing it on. And while the PC and Mac ports look pretty good, they're not going to wow anyone with their visuals. But it's when you play it on an iPhone or an iPad where the game's art direction and optimization truly shine. There were a few times where I caught myself saying wow when entering a new environment due to the simple fact that I was playing a game of this quality on my Instagram machine. The game's retro future comic book art style really brings its world to life and hides the needs for an overly detailed world. If you're a fan of Fallout or the Outer Worlds art direction, then you're definitely going to dig Beyond the Steel Sky's retro future meets corporate dystopian aesthetic. For the most part, the plot is pretty bare bones. You lose a kid, you have to go to the city to find him, nobody knows who it is, it's kind of a class thing. Yeah, nothing new here. But it's the game's world building that really sets itself apart, and quite frankly, this makes up the need for any sort of larger narrative. Its quirky sense of humor kept things fresh throughout its oftentimes pretty hardcore gameplay conventions. It's not to say the story ever felt like it was lacking, it was just a bit of a slow burn. The soundtrack and overall presentation of Beyond the Steel Sky are definitely what will keep you engaged, and it gives the feeling of a AAA title from the golden era of point-and-click adventure games. There are a few times where I let the music play through my headphones and soaked up the world around my character and just let my imagination run wild. Composer Alistair Curley knocked it out of the park with the music in Beneath the Steel Sky, and I would go as far to say that his work here is on par with some of gaming's best scores, like Journey and The Last of Us, and even some movie scores by the legendary John Williams. Look, if you don't play Beyond the Steel Sky, but you're a fan of game music, you definitely owe it to yourself to check out the tracks Gaplander, What Have You Done, and Finale. Trust me, they're worth it. So how's it play? Beyond the Steel Sky is a game that really isn't going to hold your hand. It's not to say that it was brutally difficult or frustrating like some classic adventure games, it's just going to require a bit more logic and thinking to solve its puzzles and situations. Early on in the game, you're given the ability to hack terminals and various components. Unlike most games, the hacking isn't a simple connect the dots or maze puzzle, but instead a logic-based if this then that concept. This is where Beyond the Steel Sky really shines. I often found myself walking up to panels to see if I can mess with their functions and see if I can change anything around me. There's a sense of accomplishment when solving one of the game's often brutally obvious but difficult to figure out puzzles. But it's the process of figuring out what I need to do that made me want to stop playing more than keep going. Difficulty in the game is definitely subjective, and while Beyond the Steel Sky does have a pretty intuitive hint system, I really wish it just gave me more of a hint when it came to starting its puzzles. Once you figure out what you need to do though, the game's puzzles take on a life of their own, and I really felt engaged in Beyond the Steel Sky's world. So if you're not a fan of hard puzzles or you just want something that can turn your brain off, this might not be for you. You may have noticed that the game is one of the original games that Apple used to promote its Apple Arcade service when it was in early access. So naturally, I played on every platform I could. The iPhone, the iPad, the PC, the Mac, and even an Apple TV. And the experience differs wildly between what platform you chose to play on. For this review, most of my playthrough was on an iPhone 11 Pro, and touch controls were by far some of the most intuitive and easy to use for a third-person game. Seriously, double tap to run should be industry standard at this point. That's not to say there are a few spots where the touch controls failed, and I had to shuffle around a bit to lock onto an environmental prompt. The iPad Pro with the Magic Keyboard was a different story entirely. Unfortunately, Beyond the Steel Sky just doesn't control well with Apple's overpriced touchpad or a Bluetooth mouse. There were a few times I awkwardly ran into a wall and had to drag myself out of a corner just to talk to somebody. Other than that though, Beyond the Steel Sky looks amazing on the iPad Pro, and unlike its iPhone counterpart, I rarely noticed any drop frames or felt my iPad get too hot. The iPad port does have controller support, and that's by far the best way to play Beyond the Steel Sky, so if you have the means, go with that. The Mac and PC ports are by far the best way to play the game. It took full advantage of my iMac Pro's hardware, and it was a pretty great experience. Since the game was developed to be played on a phone though, I noticed that pairing Beyond a Steel Sky with a controller was the most comfortable and engaging way to play. That's not to say that mouse and keyboard were useless, because they were better on the PC ports, and obviously the graphic fidelity was much higher than the phone version. But ultimately, I can't believe I'm going to say this, there was something more magical about playing a game of this caliber on a small screen. Throughout my time on every platform, I still found myself preferring to play the phone port, mostly due to the game's nature and being able to pick it up in short bursts wherever I was at the time. For a while, Beyond a Steel Sky became my go-to boredom game, and that's a good thing. Regardless of the platform, the game did occasionally have some issues keeping a steady frame rate, and I did experience the occasional progress stopping bug that required a reset. While this is acceptable on a phone game, since, it's a phone and all, it was annoying having to reset my PC because somebody got stuck in some geometry. Also, there's an aspect ratio discrepancy between the ports where it was displaying and outputting an ultra-wide 2.4 signal on the iPhone 11 Pro and switched to 16:9 during cutscenes and dialogue sections. This is definitely not an uncommon issue with the Apple Arcade ecosystem, but it was a bit jarring going from my phone to iMac Pro and realizing that I was missing the bottom few pixels of dialogue on my phone. It's not the biggest issue, but if you're the type that plays Apple Arcade games on multiple devices, it's worth knowing that there will be a slight aspect ratio and field of view discrepancy between ports. So, I don't know, for all three of you that care, there you go. Ultimately, Beyond a Steel Sky isn't for everyone, but by no means am I saying the game is anything but exceptional. While there were a few times I found myself getting frustrated at the game's traditional point-and-click adventure roots, I also found myself loving the game's creative world and its absolutely incredible musical composition. The story's fun, the world's interesting, and quite frankly, once you get over the rather dry first hour or so, you're in for what might be one of the best examples of an adventure game in the last few years. And you'll find that Beyond a Steel Sky is definitely worth your time. I give it an 8 out of 10.